Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to go over this week's affixes in Mythic Plus, along with some tips for adjusting and a heads up on some of the difficult situations coming your way. Today we're shooting from Freehold, because our group can't get a good Freehold key ever on a push week, so I guess I'll just spend time here while I still can. This week is Fortified, Sanguine, Grievous, and in my opinion, it is the third best week on the calendar for pushing high keys, so I think it's very likely we'll see some world first keys done in almost every dungeon this week. Although it can be a bit difficult to execute compared to some other weeks, if done right, these affixes hardly slow you down. Grievous is an affix that's almost entirely dependent on the healer. DPS players can definitely do some things to make it easier, but overall, this is something they probably won't be thinking about much. As a healer, you need to be focused much more on healing this week and less on damage, considering if you don't top party members right away, they'll take an increasing amount of damage from the dot. I think Grievous is a frustrating week for Resto Druids, as the playstyle of Druid normally involves trusting your HOTS to top people up over time to conserve mana and spell usage. However, in Grievous, you'll be forced to spam regrowth on players who aren't even in danger. Make sure to pack your bags with fish feasts and mana potions, and it might be a good idea to grab some mage food for you and your group before you run keys, because for some reason Grievous doesn't drop outside of combat. Grievous is the one affix where I think Prosperity and Soul of the Forest combination is reasonable in many dungeons, considering you're spamming regrowth constantly, and very often one Swiftmen won't be enough. If you're struggling topping people from Grievous, even with your strongest healing gear, try using Soul and Prosperity as well as Spirit of Preservation Minor for just the extra juice into your regrowth to help get people topped. There is nothing wrong with sticking to Cenarian Ward and Cultivation as well if that's what you're used to. Sanguine is an affix that is definitely tank dependent, however, all party members can contribute to helping mitigate it. The most important thing is to be careful not to kill small mobs on top of big mobs that are either stunned or casting. Very often, a tank can't drag a mob out of Sanguine immediately, either because they have no room or the mob is casting or slow. Try your best to help finish off mobs that are further away from the pack, and ideally in spots where the Sanguine pool won't block your way too much. As a druid, you have very strong tools to deal with Sanguine: Typhoon, Ursul's Vortex, and Taunt. Typhoon can be used to both pre-position mobs before they die, or knock the remaining mobs out after others have died. You can use Vortex to help keep mobs from running into Sanguine, or into pathways that you need to use later. When all else fails, Taunt can be used to pull a single mob in a direction if you need to drag it away from the tank. Just be sure to warn your team ahead of time if you're taunting, because the tank will usually just assume it's aggro loss and immediately taunt it right back. You won't really make many talent changes for Sanguine, since Typhoon should already be used in almost every situation anyway. Now let's look through the dungeons this week. I'm going to briefly go over each one so you have a heads up on what to expect this week. First, we'll start with Atal Bazaar. As with the last Fortified week, the toughest barrier is going to be Volcall on Grievous. Otherwise, there isn't going to be too much healing necessary in Atal. However, you do want to take into account that you'll need enough healing to deal with this fight, and probably want to expend Bloodlust. The other difficult parts will be dealing with the Saurids with Sanguine. However, as long as you are snapping them or killing them all at the same time, it shouldn't be too bad to handle. And even if something goes wrong, at worst it heals the mob up. It's not as bad as Bolstering Week was. In general, I don't make too many talent choices or essence changes in Atal. I'm just running my normal talent build and my normal essence setup, where I'll run Spirit of Preservation Minor instead of Formless Void. I think another option is to also run Formless Void Major, because you can use the beam to help execute Swords, and if you have Lucid Dreams available, you can steal that to help with Volcall. Now let's look at Freehold. This is going to be a good week for Freehold, because after you join the crew, you are going to have Eudora on your side. So not only is it not tyrannical, but the second boss is going to be extremely easy. There's not too many things to worry about here. We've seen a lot of groups start pulling more and more with the last boss, bombing some of these enforcer packs, which gets difficult during Sanguine. However, in pug groups, it's probably not something you're going to see. all in all, I don't think there's a whole lot to worry about in Freehold. This should be one of the easier keys this week, as long as you deal with Sanguine properly. However, there's usually plenty of room to kite around with Typhoon and Ursals and your tanks, so it shouldn't be too bad. In Freehold, I go back and forth. Sometimes I like to use my normal talent build. Other times I'll use Prosperity with Soul of the Forest. I think both are okay. In general, I like Prosperity and Soul for healing the bosses. However, because Eudora is not active, I don't think it's totally necessary in a week like this. And otherwise, I'm using my same essence setup of Crucible, Well, Spirit of Preservation, and Conflict. Next, let's look at King's Rest. I think this week is alright for King's Rest as well. There's some issues that you can have with Sanguine, namely in the first area, if the champions get caught in Sanguine while they're shielding, as well as sometimes killing these blobs if they aren't killed evenly. Other than that, though, this isn't too bad of a week. Zool is always a difficult encounter. However, Grievous and Sanguine don't really play too much a part in this, so it will be the same as any other Fortified Zool. And Grievous does make some of the bosses a little bit harder, especially King Bazaar, but because it's fortified, it shouldn't be too bad, especially after healing last week. So in King's Rest, a lot of talent options are good. You can run the normal build with Cenarian Ward Cultivation. You can also run Prosperity and Soul of the Forest for the single target burst healing. I've also been experimenting with Germination a little bit for single target healing, but only if you have a lot of mastery to make that second hot worth it. Other than that, my essence build is the same: Crucible Major, Well, Preservation, and Conflict Miners. Let's look at Shrine. I would consider this a pretty good week for Shrine. Because the boss encounters are fairly easy, Grievous doesn't play too big of a part. Most of the trash pulls are pretty easy as well. Sanguine can be an issue, especially in the second boss room with the initiates dying. However, it's not nearly as bad of an issue as it is with bolstering. It's maybe roughly the same as bursting, as long as you handle the initiates well and are knocking mobs out and kiting them around. It shouldn't be too big of a problem. There's also not too many pulls you have to do here. Once you do these mobs, that's it. You don't have to worry about keeping the pathway clear or anything like that. In general, for Shrine, I like to run a more damage-focused build with my items since there isn't too much healing required. I'll run my same talent build almost always with Cenarian Ward and Cultivation. The same essence build as well. If you don't feel the need for the single target healing, you can swap out Spirit of Preservation for Formless, as well as Well for Ever Rising Tide if you're looking to get a little bit more damage. Let's look at Siege. I would say this is an average week for Siege. You don't have to worry about Tyrannical, so that's good. And you don't have to do any spotter nonsense. In the highest level keys, using a bolstered spotter is actually probably the fastest way to deal with this dungeon. But in Pugs, I think people will mostly find Sanguine Grievous a little bit easier. A lot of the stuff in the beginning can be real annoying with Sanguine because you have high health mobs, like the Wave Tenders and the Vanguards, with low health mobs like the Footmen. Also, mobs like the Marksmen and the Snipers and the Powder Shots that don't move because they don't really melee, so it can get annoying if they get put into Sanguine. However, with some good Typhoons and some good tank management, there's not very many difficult parts of Siege. In general, Siege is another dungeon where I like to run a more damage-focused item build, and I'm running my same essences and talents. I usually don't choose to ever sub Preservation Miner in here because the last boss can be a bit difficult. But if you're still trying to push damage, you can swap out Preservation for Formless as well. Now let's look at Temple. This is actually could be a tough week for Temple. It's just a matter of dealing with the bosses on Grievous, as well as Temple seems to be a little bit slower on Fortified, just because Tyrannical doesn't slow down the bosses too much. It's good that it's not bolstering. Last Fortified week, bolstering makes the second boss room a lot harder, but now that you don't have to worry about it other than not dragging mobs into Sanguine, it won't be too bad. However, it's mainly about dealing with the Dervishes, Galvast, and the last boss, the Avatar. Groups have started to use a strategy where they use a hunter to solo the Dervishes, which can make this part a little bit easier. However, Galvast and the Avatar will still be a difficult encounter with Grievous. In general, I try to use an item build that's more focused towards healing. I'll go for heavier mastery, specifically for the last boss. Even if your damage is a little bit low in Temple, you can save time by healing the Avatar quickly on the last boss, and in general, I find that's a better trade-off anyway. In Temple, I feel that usually you need to use a major essence for mana management. I like to use Formless Void in the sense that I can steal Lucid for the bosses, and then if I don't need the mana for all the trash pulls, I can just steal Focusing Iris. If you don't have a Focusing Iris or a Lucid available to you, you may just choose to run Lucid yourself if you think you need the mana. I'm running my same talent build here. You don't want to switch from Cenarian Ward Cultivation because you need the throughput for group healing. When you run Prosperity Soul, you lose a lot of AoE healing in favor of single target, which is not what you want in Temple. Next, let's look at Motherlode. This may be one of the more difficult weeks for Motherlode. Most of the time, people are getting a majority of their trash percentage from the first area. However, Sanguine can make this really difficult. These Peacekeepers can move very slow, and they also spend a lot of time casting. So if a Peacekeeper ever gets dragged over Sanguine, or simply if a mob dies under a Peacekeeper, then they're going to heal the full after they cast just one spell. So you have to be really careful. This is an area where you definitely want to have Typhoon and want to be ready to Typhoon some of the smaller mobs away from the Peacekeepers. If you can get through this area and not full heal Peacekeepers with Sanguine, the rest of the dungeon isn't too bad. The boss encounters are usually pretty easy. The first boss can be a little tougher with Grievous on a really high key, but otherwise shouldn't be too difficult. I'm running a very average build in here. I like Cenarian Ward Cultivation for the bosses, and I'm running my normal Essence setup of Crucible, Well, Spirit Miner, and Conflict. Underrot, I would say, is an average to good week for Underrot as well. Sanguine Grievous makes some stuff a little bit harder, but not too much harder. There's not really any pulls where Sanguine becomes a big problem. It can in the second boss room when you have Blood Swarmers running around and you're chaining together mobs, but in general, this is much more favorable to Bolstering or to Tyrannical. Grievous makes Kragmaw a little bit tougher, and this is going to be your biggest healing check. In general, is going to be all this area in the second boss room. So I would plan your item and essence and talent build around this area. The rest of the dungeon is pretty straightforward. Some of these pulls in the beginning can be tough to do on Fortified if you're combining the Matron with the Headhunters with Grievous, but shouldn't be too difficult here. And the best part about Underrot is you have lots of room to move around, so Sanguine doesn't really become a problem. Here I run my normal Essence and Talent build as well. I wouldn't recommend Prosperity Soul. I usually like Cultivation for healing the second boss, but if you're very confident in your second boss healing, you maybe could get away with running Prosperity in here. Let's look at Tol Dagor. Sanguine can be actually quite difficult in Tol Dagor. The toughest area almost always is going to be Jess Howless's floor. Because the boss runs through this whole area, you can't do much to skip this floor. You have to kill almost all these mobs. There are lots of small yellows that drop Sanguine, as well as lots of small pathways that make it hard to move around. Also, when you kill this pack, the boss can actually run through the Sanguine if you phase him fast enough and heal himself, which can be annoying. In general, I find you should take this room a little bit slower this week and have a good plan on how you deal with the Sanguine. I like to have as many mobs die in this first area as possible. You can drag these 3 over, and then that way you leave this whole area for the rest, and then you can try and kill these mobs in one big pull in this side of the room, and then that way you leave this whole hallway clean. Generally, this is the toughest pull with the Block Warden and the 2 casters that you pull the Arsonist in. You should just have a plan for how you deal with Sanguine in some of the different areas. You want to pull as much outside as you can because the outside area is pretty easy and you have lots of room to move around. In Tol Dagor, I am running my normal Essence and Talent setup as well. This is another dungeon where I think it's okay to run Formless Major to steal Lucid for the first and last boss. They can be a bit difficult with Grievous, and then otherwise you can still beam for some of the bigger trash pulls. Next, let's look at Waycrest. This will be a big healing check for Waycrest this week. Waycrest is already a pretty tough dungeon to heal, and you also have Grievous to deal with, so even though it's not tyrannical, some of the bosses can be quite difficult. The toughest area with Sanguine is this hallway outside of Rawl's room. Luckily, the maggots in the hallway don't drop Sanguine, but you still need to be careful with leaving yourself enough room. In general, most teams pull as many mobs out into the courtyard as possible. That way they have all this room to move around, and then pull the mobs from Rawl's room outside into the courtyard. This is a dungeon where I'm focused very heavily on healing. This is one of the dungeons where I will run Ever Rising Tide Major with the same minor essences, conflict, preservation, and well. For talent builds, I'm running the same as well, just to help with group healing on the Sisters and Lord and Lady Waycrest. Let's look at Junkyard. Junkyard is always easy. There's almost never a bad week for Junkyard. Sanguine can be a bit annoying in some areas, but ultimately you have a ton of area to move around, so it's not too bad. Grievous makes the bosses a little bit harder, but it's fortified and you have zap bots, so they should die quick. The aerial unit was above Gunker last week here in NA, so it won't be above Gunker this week. So you'll be able to go to Gunker first, which always makes it a bit easier since it seems that most of the good bots are centralized around this area. Because time doesn't matter in terms of damage, as long as you survive with the zap bots, you likely time the key. I run a very defensive build in here with Guardian Affinity. I like running Mass Roots for the last boss, but during Sanguine, you may want to still run Typhoon anyway. And for a major essence, I'll run Ever Rising Tide Major with Conflict, Preservation Minor, and Well. And last, we have Workshop. Workshop isn't too bad on Sanguine. There's not too many big pulls that you have to do. There's only a few trash pulls in between each boss, so you don't really notice the Sanguine. Grievous, on the other hand, can make the bosses a little bit tougher, specifically the first and the last boss. The last boss is going to be the hardest part of the dungeon likely, so if you ever need to change your build, it may be for this boss. Otherwise, you don't need too much healing for this dungeon, but if you're confident that you can time the key, you can run some more defensive setups in here. I generally prefer my normal talent build with Cenarian Word Cultivation, Conflict, and Preservation Minor, but if you're worried about the last boss, you can run Formless or Lucid to get a little bit of extra mana to help deal with the Grievous. Other than that, there's not too many difficult areas here. You may run into problems with some of these packs with the shields and Sanguine dropping in the shields, but they're not too difficult and they should die pretty quickly. That goes over all the dungeons this week. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you liked it and subscribed to my channel. I'll be making a separate video for each affix combination, as well as more high-level Mythic Plus content going into Shadowlands. Be sure, if you want to see keys this week, check out my stream at twitch.tv/YummyTV. We'll be pushing high keys on these affixes all week. Happy keying.